we're on the sort of forces driving change for trustees around ESG and climate change risks. And I think it's really been made clear by the TPR. This just makes it even more clear. You know, sources of carbon, you know, it's in all sectors. Trustees need to understand, you know, the overall carbon emissions generated from their underlying investments as a part of the TCFD reporting requirements. And as the world moves from fossil fuels to renewables in that sort of energy transition, it's going to have a far wider impact on many sectors, companies, which all use, you know, sources of energy, and the effects of this transition away from carbon-intensive sectors and overall decarbonization will largely impact the majority of our funds and the constituent holding companies within that. And so, you know, we've seen through the scenario analysis that understanding the underlying exposure at fund, sector, and ISIN level is important, and we really need to start as an industry quantifying that risk. And the best way to start is really by getting your hands on reporting and data available to you at a portfolio and sector and ISIN level.
So thanks, Scott. Really interesting, and it just shows how widespread, you know, carbon emissions are across all industries, but more importantly, how energy contributes to the total global carbon emissions. It's quite frightening, actually, and quite shocking. So, given the extent of the impact of high carbon, what data is actually available, you know, on carbon emissions for trustees?
Yeah, so as I highlighted in one of the previous slides, you know, data availability and the methodology behind that data is imperfect at the moment, but there are frameworks out there that we can start to use today to get a head start on managing and monitoring those ESG and climate risks. And so if we're looking specifically at the TCFD, you know, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures requirements, there are bold ambitions within that of embedding climate change governance, strategy, risk management considerations into a scheme's overall investment process. However, the baseline to start all of that is really to get your hands on key metrics and set appropriate targets off the back of that in relation to things like total carbon emissions, total carbon footprint, and weighted average carbon intensity scores for your portfolio and the underlying funds that you hold and underlying ISINs within those funds from a scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 carbon data perspective. And so, yeah, I think the direct and indirect data challenge, there are sort of issues with collecting direct and indirect carbon data. You know, scope 1 and 2 data is more available than scope 3 data. And certainly there are issues around data quality and availability of scope 3 data, as it's the most difficult challenge for companies and issuers to start to collect and report on. You know, it's a full sort of supply chain and sort of traceability issue for companies to understand the carbon that goes into the full life cycle of the products that they offer. And this is across all sectors. You know, it's not just from a car manufacturer or a food producer, for example, but it can even impact things like, you know, financials, where banks need to consider the sort of scope 3 emissions of their underlying investments in the companies that they issue money to. And emissions intensity can be calculated once you've got your hand on all that data, and you can start to set appropriate benchmarks and targets by industry, by sector, at a fund and portfolio level once you get a start on collecting all that data. And so from our perspective and what we've seen so far, you know, the key challenges around varying methodologies to assess and report on that data are there, but having a sort of single source of truth report that covers your full portfolio or the full extent of your portfolio as much as possible on scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions can really give you as a scheme a head start and a baseline understanding of your overall sort of carbon risks and carbon metrics that then flow into the governance process that you need to start to build as a scheme as a part of managing climate change risks, and of course TCFD reporting off the back of it as well.